Hello everyone, I'm glad you're here tonight. Before we begin, let me ask you something simple but curious. Where are you listening from, and what time is it where you are right now? I always find it fascinating to imagine people scattered across different lands, some just waking up, others ready to drift into sleep, yet all gathered around the same story. And this story, the one I want to share with you, takes us back to the medieval world, inside the kitchens of kings, where the hidden life of royal cooks unfolds like a quiet but essential tale. When most people imagine the Middle Ages, they think of knights in shining armor, castles with towering walls, tournaments, and maybe the solemn faces of monarchs sitting on thrones. Yet behind the majesty, behind the ceremony and glittering displays of wealth, there were the kitchens, enormous, smoky, and filled with an endless rhythm of labor. To be a royal cook was not merely to prepare food, it was to exist at the very heart of court life, responsible for sustaining kings, queens, nobles, and often hundreds of guests who expected nothing short of wonder at the banquet table. Picture, if you will, the great stone halls of a medieval castle, their ceilings blackened with centuries of smoke from hearths and braziers. In the kitchens, huge fires blazed day and night, spitting and hissing as logs cracked under the heat. Chains clinked as massive iron cauldrons swung above the flames, filled with broths, stews, and sometimes whole carcasses of animals simmering for hours. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of roasted meats, baked breads, pungent spices, and the dampness of stone walls that never fully dried. For the cook, this was the kingdom within the kingdom. The king's cook was no ordinary servant. His position demanded skill, loyalty, and secrecy. He was trusted not only with the taste of the food but with the very life of the monarch. Poison was a constant fear, and so every dish had to be tested, guarded, and prepared under the sharp eyes of assistants and tasters. The cook knew that a careless mistake could mean disgrace, punishment, or worse. Yet, despite the danger, there was pride in the role. To prepare a feast that dazzled foreign ambassadors or silenced the grumbling of nobles was a kind of victory equal to that of a knight returning from battle. Meals for kings were not the same as those of common folk. While peasants lived on coarse bread, pottage, and whatever vegetables they could grow, the royal table displayed abundance meant to impress. Venison hunted in the royal forests, swans roasted with golden glazes, fish carried fresh from rivers and seas, and exotic spices brought from distant lands by merchants who risked deserts and storms. Saffron, cinnamon, and cloves might appear in dishes not merely for flavor but as symbols of wealth, since their cost was greater than that of precious metals. Imagine, for a moment, a thick sauce rich with almond milk and ginger, poured over tender cuts of meat, or pies shaped like castles themselves, with layers of fruit, meat, and sugar all encased in intricate crusts. But life in the kitchen was not only about grandeur. It was sweat, noise, and exhaustion. The head cook commanded a small army, boys to turn the spits, women to knead dough and churn butter, men to butcher, chop, and haul water in endless buckets. The air was hot, smoky, and heavy with grease. Burns were constant, cuts unavoidable, and tempers often flared when the pressure of an approaching feast grew unbearable. Yet amid the chaos, there was rhythm, almost like a song, as knives chopped, cauldrons bubbled, and bread rose in ovens built against the thick castle walls. The cook himself was expected to be more than just skilled with ingredients. He needed to understand the seasons, to know when fresh herbs would be gathered, when the hunting would yield the best meat, when fish would swim close enough to shore. He had to calculate portions for gatherings that sometimes included hundreds of mouths, balancing extravagance with practicality. And always, he had to keep in mind the delicate stomach of the king, whose health might falter with even the smallest mistake. For in the medieval imagination, food was medicine as much as sustenance, and a poorly chosen ingredient could be seen as not just incompetence, but betrayal. And so, behind the grand spectacles of medieval banquets, the cook became an unseen architect of the kingdom's image. When a foreign ambassador sat down at the royal table, the meal was as much a negotiation as any treaty. Each dish carried meaning. A roasted peacock with its feathers restored and displayed might symbolize majesty, gilded pastries dusted with sugar spoke of wealth. A platter of rare fish hinted at dominion over wide waters. The cook orchestrated all of this silently, shaping perceptions with spices and sauces. It is said that some cooks guarded their recipes like treasures. Instructions for preparing a sauce might be passed from master to apprentice in whispers, written down only in code, lest rivals steal the secret. And secrets were valuable indeed. A single new recipe, something unseen at another court, could set tongues wagging for weeks, elevating a king's reputation and a cook's worth. But recipes were not only for glory. They could be weapons too. Imagine the suspicion if a dish made the king ill. Whispers would spread faster than wildfire, accusing fingers pointing at the cook, regardless of innocence. To work in the kitchen of kings was to live forever under the weight of expectation, danger, and reward. Even in quieter times, when no feast loomed, the rhythm of the kitchen never ceased. Bread had to be baked daily, beer brewed in vast quantities, stores of grain and salted meat checked against rot or theft. The cook walked through storerooms lined with barrels of honey, sacks of flour, wheels of cheese, smoked fish, and spices locked in chests as if they were jewels. Each item was a promise of survival through winter or the guarantee of hospitality to guests. In this world of fire, steel, and endless labor, the royal cook became a figure half hidden yet vital, shaping the health, the politics, and even the reputation of the realm, all with the turn of a ladle or the carving of a roast. The castle kitchen was often the beating heart of the royal household, though few outside its walls ever thought of it that way. Courtiers might have spoken of politics, alliances, and wars, but none of it could have carried on without the food that kept bodies strong and spirits lifted. To be in charge of that, to hold the king's appetite and the health of his court in one's hands, was to carry an invisible crown of responsibility. And while a knight might win fame on the battlefield, a cook earned his worth in the shadows, known only to those who relied on his craft each day. Imagine walking into such a kitchen during the morning hours. The fires have been stirred back to life, embers glowing as new logs are placed. The air smells faintly of smoke and last night's roasting, yet already fresh scents begin to rise. Onions chopped, herbs crushed with a stone mortar, dough rolled and set to rise in the warm corners of the room. The kitchen boys scurry about, fetching buckets of water from the well, while apprentices sharpen knives on whetstones, the metallic rasp echoing through the space. Everyone knows their task, for each role is part of the great machinery that must never falter. The cook himself would stride among them, not with the armor of a knight or the robes of a nobleman, but with authority nonetheless. His apron would be marked with the stains of countless meals, his hands rough from heat and constant work. Yet there was pride in his step. He knew he could command respect simply by lifting a ladle and tasting the broth, for one frown or nod from him could send the entire kitchen into new motion. Assistants watched him carefully, knowing his judgment was swift. Too much salt, too little spice, too heavy a hand with the flour. Such mistakes could cost more than food, they could cost reputation. Meals for a king were not bound by simplicity. Even a breakfast might include spiced wines, roasted meats, fresh bread still steaming from the oven, and delicate cheeses wrapped in herbs. While commoners would chew on coarse rye bread and thin soup, the royal household expected variety at every turn. And so the cook had to maintain endless creativity, drawing upon his knowledge of herbs, meats, and grains to craft meals that never grew dull. It was not enough to feed hunger. He had to feed curiosity, to surprise, to enchant. At times, the cook's work became performance. During great feasts, dishes might be designed not only to taste magnificent but to astonish the eye. There are tales of pies that, when cut open, released live birds into the hall, fluttering above astonished guests. Sugar sculptures, molded into castles or beasts, gleamed like jewels under the glow of torchlight. Roasted animals might be redressed in their feathers or furs, presented whole as if they had come back to life for one final, glorious display. Every feast was a stage, and the cook its hidden director. Yet the work was also unrelenting. The heat of the fires never ceased, even in the height of summer when the air outside hung heavy with humidity. Sweat poured from brows, arms grew weary from lifting pots larger than a man's torso, and the smell of grease clung to clothes no matter how many times they were washed. In winter, when frost lined the castle walls and water froze in the buckets, The fires provided some comfort, yet the task of keeping ingredients fresh became more complicated. The cook needed to understand how to salt meats, dry fish, store grains against dampness, and guard precious spices from thieves. There was also the matter of hierarchy within the kitchen. Beneath the head cook were countless others, each with defined roles. The pantler oversaw bread, the saucer prepared sauces, the butler managed drinks, and the scullions, often the youngest and poorest, scrubbed pots until their hands were raw. It was a world within a world, with its own rules, punishments, and rewards. To rise in such a hierarchy demanded years of patience, skill, and favor from the master cook, who chose whom to trust with more delicate tasks. Despite the harshness, there was camaraderie too. Long nights spent preparing for feasts bound the kitchen staff together. Jokes were shared over flower-covered tables, songs hummed as spits turned slowly, and stories passed among the servants about distant lands or whispered rumors of court intrigue. For though the cook himself rarely stood in the great halls during feasts, his assistants heard the echoes of laughter, the music, the speeches drifting from beyond the kitchen doors. They knew that, in some small way, their labor fueled those celebrations. And always, behind the noise of knives and crackling fires, there was the quiet hum of danger. The possibility of poison hung in the air, a shadow that no one dared forget. Some dishes were tested by tasters before reaching the king's lips, yet the cook bore the ultimate responsibility. If something went wrong, no excuse could shield him. There were stories of cooks punished or even executed for accidents, though not all of those tales were true. Still, the fear lingered, like smoke that never cleared. To serve a king was an honor, but also a gamble with one's own life. Outside the kitchen, life moved differently. The courtyards rang with clashing swords, the chapels filled with prayers, the chambers echoed with the shuffle of gowns and boots. But in the kitchen, time followed the rhythm of meals. Sunrise meant breakfast preparations, midday meant heavier courses, and evening brought the grandeur of supper. It was a cycle that never broke, a wheel turning endlessly, driven by hunger and expectation. And as the years passed, the cook became almost invisible to the outside world. Few courtiers remembered his face, fewer still spoke his name. But when ambassadors left the castle praising the splendor of a banquet, or when nobles boasted of dishes they had never seen before, the cook's work lingered quietly in their words. It was a strange kind of immortality, to be forgotten by men yet remembered by flavors and by the satisfaction of a feast. Beyond the endless labor of preparing meals, there was also the delicate art of planning. A royal cook needed to think far ahead, not only about the next feast but about the entire rhythm of the seasons. He had to know when the hunting parties would return with deer, boar, or pheasant, and he had to prepare ways to preserve the meat for weeks or months. Salting, smoking, and drying were his allies, and entire chambers of the castle were filled with the pungent smell of salted flesh hanging from hooks. In summer, when fresh fruits and herbs filled the gardens, the cook busied himself with preserving jams, syrups, and flavored vinegars to ensure that even in the heart of winter, the table would still hold traces of sweetness. The royal gardens themselves were places of quiet importance to him. While nobles might stroll among the flowers or sit in shaded arbors, the cook looked at the rows of herbs and vegetables with a practical eye. Basil, sage, rosemary, and thyme were not simply plants. They were tools, each with a purpose in flavor and in medicine. Mint cooled the breath, parsley eased the stomach, garlic warded off illness, or so it was believed. The cook needed to know not only how to mix them for taste but how they might affect the health of those who consumed them. In an age when doctors prescribed strange concoctions of ground pearls or boiled roots, the cook's knowledge of herbs often mattered just as much. Spices, however, remained his most guarded treasures. Locked in small chests, guarded as though they were gold, spices gave royal meals their splendor. Black pepper was so valuable that a handful might pay a man's yearly rent. Cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves traveled from faraway islands, carried by merchants through deserts and seas, and when they finally reached the royal kitchen, they were measured grain by grain. The cook knew that a dish scented with saffron not only tasted rich but glittered golden in the light, dazzling all who saw it. And yet, he also knew that too heavy a hand could ruin both the flavor and the treasury. His balance had to be perfect. There was also the matter of meat, for kings did not live as peasants did. Hunting was not only a pastime but a demonstration of power, and the animals taken in royal forests often ended on the king's table. Venison roasted until tender, wild boar seasoned with pepper and garlic, game birds layered in pies. It all displayed dominion over the land. The cook often received these animals still whole, sometimes still warm from the hunt, and it fell upon his staff to clean, butcher, and prepare them in ways that removed the wildness and replaced it with refinement. To transform a beast of the forest into a jewel of the banquet was an act of skill, and many cooks took quiet pride in mastering it. But not every meal was a grand spectacle. On ordinary days, the cook had to balance extravagance with nourishment. The king still needed bread, soups, and simpler roasts, and though these were humbler dishes, they required as much care. Bread especially was sacred. A mistake in baking could mean waste, and waste was unforgivable in a household that had to feed hundreds. The baker worked under the watchful eye of the cook, for bread was the foundation of every table, royal or common. White bread, made from fine wheat, was reserved for the king and his immediate circle, while darker loaves went to servants and soldiers. The difference was not only in taste but in status, and the cook ensured those lines were never blurred. At times, the kitchen echoed not only with labor but with stories. Servants whispered about the strange demands of visiting lords, who insisted on foods from their own regions, or about nobles who grew jealous when their neighbor received a more elaborate dish. Rumors floated through the smoky air like sparks from the fire, rumors of alliances, betrayals, even of plots. Though the cook himself seldom left his domain, he learned much of the court simply by listening to the chatter of those who carried dishes to the great hall. Information traveled as swiftly as aromas, and sometimes it was difficult to tell which had the greater power. And then there were the festivals. No ordinary day compared to a feast prepared for a wedding, a coronation, or the arrival of a foreign king. In those moments, the cook's task became monumental. Entire days, even weeks, went into preparation. Cattle were slaughtered in numbers, fish were caught in rivers until nets nearly burst, and barrels of wine were rolled into storerooms. Sweetmeats made of almonds and honey were shaped into figures, while sugar, still a luxury, was sculpted into towers and animals that gleamed like crystal under torchlight. The pressure was immense, for a feast could make or break the impression of an entire kingdom. If the guests left in awe, the king's prestige soared. If they left unimpressed, whispers of weakness spread. And so, the cook labored as though the fate of nations rested on his ladles. But with such splendor came risks. Fires roared higher, more hands crowded into the kitchen, and accidents grew frequent. A spilled pot of boiling broth, a knife slipping in haste, a fire leaping beyond control. Such dangers lurked in every corner. Yet few thought of them when the hall above echoed with music and laughter. The guests never saw the sweat, the burns, the cuts. They saw only the golden platters carried before them, the roasted swans, the glittering pastries, the endless stream of dishes that seemed to appear as if by magic. The cook knew otherwise. He knew the toll it took on every man and woman who worked under him, the exhaustion that left them asleep on benches before dawn only to wake again to the same demands. Still, there was pride in it. Pride in knowing that no matter how little glory reached their names, their craft shaped the memories of kings. A single dish could leave such an impression that it was remembered years later, spoken of in foreign lands as a marvel. For the cook, who seldom received applause, that knowledge was enough to keep his head high. And so, in the flickering firelight of those vast kitchens, surrounded by smoke, sweat, and the endless motion of knives and ladles, the royal cook carried on, the unseen hand that sustained the grandeur of the Middle Ages. While the grand feasts dazzled with spectacle, there was another side to the life of a royal cook that was far more subtle and constant: the art of managing provisions. For every roasted swan that impressed the nobility, there were endless barrels of flour, sacks of grain, and wheels of cheese that had to be accounted for. A cook who failed at managing stores could bring hunger to the entire court, and in such matters, excuses were never accepted. It was not simply about cooking. It was about survival, order, and discipline. Deep within the castle, storerooms stretched like hidden caves. Cool, dark, and smelling of earth and wood, they held salted fish, dried beans, smoked hams, and great barrels of ale. The cook walked these storerooms like a careful steward, counting, planning, and worrying. Mice and rats were constant enemies, their scratching in the night a reminder that vigilance was endless. Cats were kept to hunt them, yet even they could not chase away every intruder. A single spoiled barrel, a sack of grain gone to mold, could mean shortages that would echo throughout the season. The cook's mind was always balancing, always measuring, always looking months ahead. And then there were the cellars, cool and damp, where casks of wine were stacked in long, shadowed rows. Wine was not merely a drink, it was a symbol of prestige. To serve poor wine was to insult a guest, to weaken a king's image. The cook worked with the butler to ensure that the wines chosen for feasts matched the dishes he prepared. Strong red wines with roasted meats, lighter whites with fish, sweet spiced wines at the end of meals. Even this choice carried weight, for foreign ambassadors would judge not only the words of treaties but the flavors of the table. Day by day, the cook lived in two worlds, the noise and fire of the kitchen and the cool silence of storerooms and cellars. In one, chaos reigned with knives and flames. In the other, calculation ruled with numbers and planning. Few understood that his true power lay not only in the moment of cooking but in this quiet stewardship, where the survival of a winter or the success of a feast could be won or lost long before the meal began. The cook also had to contend with the seasons in ways that shaped every dish. Spring brought fresh greens, tender herbs, and the first lambs of the year. Summer filled the tables with berries, cherries, and cucumbers, their freshness fleeting. Autumn was a season of abundance, grapes for wine, apples for cider, and the great harvest of grains. But winter pressed hardest, when fresh produce vanished and the table relied on stores. Dried peas, salted pork, and the preserved fruits of summer became lifelines. To turn these humble supplies into meals fit for royalty required true mastery. A clever cook could disguise the sameness of winter foods with clever sauces, with spices sparingly sprinkled, with breads baked in new shapes. Creativity was not a luxury but a necessity. The apprentices who served in the kitchen learned these lessons slowly, often through mistakes. A boy who salted meat too lightly might watch it rot within weeks, his error remembered long after. Another who scorched bread might find himself punished by hours of cleaning pans. But for those who endured, there was knowledge to be gained, knowledge that carried its own form of power. To learn from a master cook was to step closer to influence, for the kitchens of nobility were always in need of skilled hands. Many a cook who began turning spits as a child ended his days as a respected figure in a great household, his craft valued like that of a musician or physician. There was also an unspoken connection between the cook and the king. Though they rarely spoke directly, the bond was there, forged through trust. The king's health, his mood, even his diplomacy depended in part on the meals set before him. A poor dish could sour a day, a grand feast could soften the heart of an enemy. The cook's loyalty was tested not with words but with ladles and knives. And though his work was often hidden, the cook knew he was closer to the pulse of the kingdom than most who strutted in silken robes through the halls above. Banquets themselves often became theaters of subtle competition. Nobles compared the richness of dishes served at one table to those of another court. Cooks, though silent, were pitted against one another, their reputations carried far and wide. A visiting ambassador might return home with tales not only of the king's words but of the extraordinary dishes he had tasted. In this way, the cook became a diplomat without ever leaving his kitchen. His artistry could strengthen alliances or, through failure, weaken them. The stakes were far greater than the taste of a single meal. But amid all this grandeur, there were quieter moments too. The cook, after hours of command, might sit at a small table in the corner of the kitchen, a bowl of stew before him, the same stew that servants and guards would eat. In those rare moments of calm, he was not the architect of splendor but simply a man, weary and thoughtful, listening to the crackle of the dying fires. Perhaps he remembered his youth, when he too was an apprentice, clumsy with knives and awed by the mysteries of the trade. Perhaps he thought of the fleeting nature of glory, how a dish that astonished tonight would be forgotten tomorrow. And yet, in those quiet bowls of stew, there was a certain peace, a reminder that beneath the gold and spice, food was still food, and hunger was the same for kings and servants alike. Still, dawn would come again, and the cycle would begin anew. Fires would be lit, knives sharpened, orders shouted, and the endless labor of feeding a kingdom would return. For such was the life of the cook, never finished, never truly resting, always moving forward like the turning of the seasons. And though the banners above the castle might change, though kings might rise and fall, the cook remained, steady as the hearth, his legacy woven not in words or battles, but in the quiet satisfaction of full tables and silenced hunger. What many people forget when imagining the grand life of kings is that behind the glittering feasts and heavy golden goblets was a constant anxiety about appearances. The cook understood this better than most, for he knew that every dish was a message. If the bread arrived at the table fresh and soft, it told guests of plenty. If the meats were tender and richly seasoned, it spoke of the kingdom's power to command the best of the land and the seas. But if a dish fell flat, if a sauce separated, if a roast was dry, the murmurs of dissatisfaction could spread like smoke. Nobles judged not only the ruler but the household itself by what was set before them. The cook therefore carried the unspoken weight of the crown itself, balancing it carefully on a ladle rather than on a jeweled headpiece. It was for this reason that he demanded perfection from those beneath him. Apprentices quickly learned that the smallest detail mattered. A sauce stirred in the wrong direction, a spice added at the wrong moment, bread left to rise a little too long, any of these could bring the master's wrath. To modern eyes, such precision might seem harsh, but in the medieval world where reputation meant survival, such standards were essential. A cook who let sloppiness enter his kitchen might find himself dismissed, and dismissal from such a place was not merely the loss of work but the loss of honor. Yet for all the sternness, the kitchen was also a place of learning and growth. Stories were told of apprentices who, after years of toil, developed their own subtle skills. One boy might prove a natural with sauces, another with breads, another with butchering. The master cook, though slow to praise, kept watch, and when he found talent, he nurtured it. In this way, the kitchen was both a battlefield and a school, its lessons carved in scars from burns and in the rhythm of endless repetition. The sounds of the kitchen formed their own music, different from the lutes and harps in the halls above. The steady chopping of knives, the bubbling of pots, the thump of kneading dough, and the crackling of fire created a symphony of labor. To those within it, the sounds became comforting, familiar, almost like a heartbeat. Even the clamor of shouted orders, the clang of iron pots, and the rush of footsteps across the stone floor became part of that constant rhythm. It was a world apart from the quiet of chambers and chapels, a world alive with motion, heat, and urgency. What perhaps made the cook's life most complex was the balance between secrecy and display. He held knowledge of recipes that few others knew, recipes guarded as though they were treasures of the crown. A certain mixture of herbs for curing meat, a method for roasting that preserved the juices, a way to combine spices so that their heat did not overwhelm, all of these were closely kept secrets. An apprentice might serve for years before being trusted with such knowledge, and even then, the instructions might be given in riddles or vague words, forcing him to prove himself through trial and error. To give away such secrets carelessly would be a betrayal, not only to the cook but to the king he served. And yet, when the feast was laid before the guests, the cook's work became the most public of all. Dishes were carried into the great hall with trumpets, paraded like trophies, admired by all who sat at the table. The cook himself remained unseen, perhaps watching from the shadows of a doorway or listening from the kitchen as reports filtered back. His heart might swell with pride when he heard laughter and praise, or sink with dread if the hall grew silent at a particular dish. For though the feast was meant to glorify the king, it also reflected upon the cook who had crafted it. The cook's life was also filled with strange encounters. Foreign emissaries sometimes brought with them new ingredients, rice from distant lands, sugar from the east, or strange fruits that few in the kingdom had ever tasted. To experiment with these was both exciting and dangerous. Too bold a use might confuse or repel noble palates, while too cautious an attempt might waste the rare and costly gift. The cook walked a knife's edge, balancing tradition with innovation. Sometimes, a new dish would succeed so brilliantly that it became the talk of the court. Other times, it would vanish into silence, never to be attempted again. In quieter hours, when the fires burned low and the kitchen settled into calm, the cook might reflect on his peculiar place in the world. He was neither knight nor priest, neither noble nor common laborer. He lived in a strange space between worlds, close enough to power to feel its heat, yet far enough from recognition to remain invisible. His hands bore the scars of endless toil, yet his mind carried knowledge that shaped kings' lives. Few would ever sing of a cook's deeds, yet every king who sat in glory owed him a debt greater than most would admit. There were times, too, when the cook became a keeper of secrets far beyond recipes. In the quiet of storerooms or while preparing late-night meals, servants whispered of alliances, of betrayals, of forbidden loves. The cook listened, sometimes pretending not to hear, for knowledge could be as dangerous as poison. Yet he remembered always. He knew which noble preferred more wine than was wise, which ambassador grew pale at the sight of certain dishes, which servant carried whispers from one chamber to another. He held a map of the court in his mind, traced not with ink but with flavors, habits, and secrets. And through it all he carried on, day after day, year after year. Kings aged, children grew, wars came and went, but the kitchen fires never died. The same rhythms echoed through the stone halls, bread rising, pots boiling, knives chopping, feasts dazzling. It was a cycle as steady as the seasons, and the cook, though nameless to most, was its guardian. His reward was not fame or wealth, but the quiet knowledge that without him, the grandeur of the court could never have been sustained. As years passed, the cook's role only grew heavier with responsibility. Age added wisdom, but it also added aches to his bones and weariness to his hands. Yet in the medieval world, a man was valued as long as he could perform, and so he rose each morning before the sun, leaning on familiar motions as one leans on an old friend. The fire greeted him like an adversary that had never once lost its strength. The knife lay waiting, its edge needing constant care. The rhythms of the kitchen became the rhythms of his own body, so that even in dreams he found himself stirring, chopping, seasoning, always tending to the invisible hunger of the kingdom. There was a strange sense of continuity in his craft. The noble children who once peered curiously into the kitchen grew into men and women, ruling and marrying, yet the cook remained, a constant presence hidden behind the veil of smoke. He cooked for their baptisms, their weddings, their victories, and their funerals. Food was the thread binding all these occasions together, and he was the weaver. To him, the court appeared less as a place of grandeur and more as a cycle of appetite, a wheel that turned endlessly, demanding the same labors again and again. Despite his loyalty, the cook never forgot that his position was fragile. A single failed banquet could bring disgrace. A whisper of suspicion, perhaps a noble falling ill after a meal, could end a career or even a life. Poison was always a shadow that followed cooks. Though he never stooped to such deeds, he lived with the knowledge that suspicion alone could undo him. For this reason, he sometimes tasted dishes before they left the kitchen, not only to judge their flavor but to prove his innocence should anything go awry. It was a risk, but in his world, trust had to be earned with every bite. The kitchen itself was more than a workplace. It was a fortress of smells and sounds. Its walls, darkened with centuries of smoke, held layers of history. Each stone seemed to echo with voices long gone, with the laughter of apprentices who had moved on, with the curses of butchers long dead. The smell of roasted meats, baked breads, spiced sauces, and charred wood seeped into the very stones. Visitors often found it overwhelming, but to those who lived within it, the air itself became familiar, almost comforting. It was the scent of survival, of constancy, of labor that never ended. Among the most curious challenges he faced were the whims of fashion. What was considered luxurious in one decade might be dismissed as plain in the next. Nobles, ever eager to show their refinement, demanded novelty. One year they clamored for heavily spiced meats, the next for lighter, sweeter dishes, and the year after for foreign delicacies few had ever seen. The cook adapted with quiet patience. He studied trends, listened to rumors from traveling merchants, experimented in secret, and always remained ready to present something that would satisfy shifting tastes. In this way, he became not only a servant of the present but also a cautious prophet of what might please tomorrow. It was in these experiments that he often felt closest to artistry. Alone in the late hours, when the hall was silent and even the fire burned low, he would test new combinations. A sprinkling of cinnamon where none was expected, a sauce thickened in a different way, a dish presented with surprising colors. These were small acts of rebellion against monotony, moments when he reminded himself that cooking was not merely labor but also creation. Whether anyone noticed was less important than the quiet pride he felt in his own skill. His apprentices watched him with awe and fear. To them, he was both tyrant and teacher. He punished mistakes harshly, for he knew the cost of carelessness. Yet when one of them showed true dedication, he could be unexpectedly generous. He might share a secret method, or speak a rare word of praise. These gestures, though small, could change the course of a life. Many who trained under him went on to serve other lords and kings, carrying fragments of his knowledge into new kitchens, spreading his unseen influence across the land. But he himself remained where he was. The thought of leaving never took root in him, for the kitchen was his world. He had long ceased to imagine life beyond its walls. The court above him changed with the tides of politics, but the kitchen remained, steady as the stones that held it together. The cook found comfort in that stability. He did not seek glory or adventure. His victories were measured in satisfied faces, in the silence that followed a good meal, in the steady continuation of the feast. And yet, he could not escape moments of quiet longing. When he stood alone in the stillness, he sometimes wondered what it might be like to be remembered. Kings had their chronicles, knights their songs, priests their sermons. But who would remember the cook? His dishes vanished as quickly as they appeared, swallowed into silence. His legacy lay only in the fleeting pleasure of taste, in the brief moment when hunger was eased. He accepted this fate with humility, yet in his heart he carried the faint ache of invisibility. Still he endured, for in his endurance lay a kind of nobility. The kingdom could not function without him, even if few ever acknowledged it. He stood as a hidden pillar, holding up the structure of royal life, unseen but essential. And as long as the fires burned, as long as the tables groaned beneath the weight of food, the cook's hands would continue their work, steady and tireless, shaping the unseen history of the medieval world, one meal at a time. The deeper one looks into the world of the medieval cook, the clearer it becomes that his work was not only about feeding bodies but also about feeding illusions. A royal feast was never simply a meal. It was a performance, an unspoken play in which each dish carried meaning far beyond its flavor. A roasted peacock with its feathers reattached was not placed on the table for sustenance, but to dazzle the eyes, to whisper of wealth and power, to remind foreign envoys that they dined with a ruler whose resources seemed limitless. The cook knew this better than anyone, for he was the architect of such illusions, the hidden hand crafting spectacles that impressed long before the first bite was taken. He sometimes marveled at the extravagance demanded of him. There were occasions when entire castles of pastry were constructed, adorned with sugar windows and almond walls, only to be shattered in a single evening. He labored for weeks on a feast that vanished in hours, leaving behind only crumbs and memory. Yet he understood that this was the nature of his work. Food was a fleeting art, never meant to last, and therein lay both its beauty and its curse. Unlike the stone of cathedrals or the ink of scribes, his craft lived only as long as hunger persisted. The court itself was a world of contrasts, and nowhere was this clearer than in the kitchen. While the nobles above argued over politics and treaties, the cooks below debated salt and spice, fat and fire. Each world seemed trivial to the other, yet both were essential. The cook often thought of this as he stirred his pots. A dish prepared poorly could ruin a treaty as surely as a clumsy word in negotiation. He saw this truth unfold more than once, when a visiting noble left insulted because the feast did not match his expectations. In those moments, the cook realized that his knives carried as much weight as any sword. Despite his invisibility, he sometimes caught glimpses of the court's secrets. Servants gossiped freely, and the kitchen was a place where whispers traveled quickly. He heard of betrayals and alliances, of marriages arranged in cold calculation, of lords ruined by debts. Though he rarely left the kitchen, he knew much of what happened in the halls above, often before it became public knowledge. Yet he kept silent, for silence was part of survival. A careless tongue could be more dangerous than a dull blade. The cook learned long ago that discretion was his strongest armor. One of the most curious aspects of his work was the handling of exotic ingredients. In an age when most people never saw beyond their village, he touched goods from across the world. Spices from the east, wines from distant vineyards, dried fruits carried overseas, honey from faraway lands. These passed through his hands daily. Each was expensive, guarded like treasure, measured with care. Sometimes he imagined the journeys these ingredients had taken, the ships braving storms, the merchants bargaining in crowded bazaars, the caravans trudging across deserts. Though he never traveled far, the cook felt connected to a wider world through these silent companions in his kitchen. And yet, there was another side to his life that outsiders rarely considered. While nobles feasted on luxuries, the cook himself often ate scraps. The best portions were reserved for the lords and ladies, while he and his staff survived on what remained: bones stripped of meat, stale bread soaked in broth, the trimmings of vegetables. It was a quiet irony that the man responsible for feeding kings lived on food unfit for their tables. Still, he accepted this without bitterness. Hunger was the great teacher of patience, and he had learned its lessons well in his youth. In quieter moments, he reflected on how food shaped the rhythm of court life. The year itself was measured not by dates on parchment but by feasts and fasts. Easter brought lamb, Christmas brought boar, Lent demanded simplicity, harvest called for abundance. The cook's calendar was written in flavors and traditions. He knew that when geese grew fat, autumn was near. When strawberries appeared, summer had arrived. His senses were his almanac, and through them he felt time more deeply than those who counted only days. Among the most memorable events were the great hunts. When the king returned with stags or boars, the kitchen became a theater of urgency. The carcasses arrived heavy and raw, still carrying the wildness of the forest. The cook and his men transformed them into feasts fit for nobility, turning the violence of the hunt into the elegance of roasted meat presented on silver platters. In those moments, the cook sensed the connection between nature and power, between the untamed world and the order imposed upon it by fire, spice, and knife. There were times, however, when food failed to mask reality. During famine years, when fields yielded little and common folk starved, even the royal kitchen felt the strain. Supplies grew scarce, substitutions had to be made, and the cook was forced to stretch ingredients beyond reason. He learned to disguise thinness with spice, to make little appear abundant, to conjure feasts from shadows. The nobles still dined, of course, but the cook knew that outside the castle walls, hunger gnawed at countless lives. It was a truth that weighed on him, though he rarely spoke of it. He was a servant, and servants did not question the order of the world. Through all of this, he found small comforts. The crackle of fire on a cold morning, the rhythm of a knife on wood, the shared exhaustion after a long night's work, these became his companions. He took pride in the discipline of his craft, in the order he could impose on chaos. And though the feasts vanished, though his name was rarely spoken, the cook knew that in every satisfied sigh, in every raised goblet, in every moment when silence fell over a hall filled with chewing mouths, his presence lingered. He was the unseen hand behind the grandeur, the quiet soul who gave shape to celebration, the man whose work fed the very heart of the medieval court. The cook's world was one of shadows and light, of silence punctuated by sudden chaos, of endless repetition that somehow never repeated itself exactly the same. He lived in rhythms others never saw. When courtiers still slept, he was already awake, feeding fires and grinding spices. When the last goblets were drained, when nobles staggered to their chambers, he was still awake, clearing bones and ashes. It was a life that left little space for his own desires, but within it he discovered strange depths of observation, an intimacy with the passing of time that few ever experienced. He came to understand that power in the medieval world was not only measured by armies or treasures but by how well one could eat. A king who offered stale bread and thin broth would lose the respect of his guests no matter how mighty his soldiers. A noble who presented tables groaning with roasted meats, sweet pastries, and exotic spices earned loyalty before a word of diplomacy was spoken. The cook carried this truth in his hands. His art could soothe tensions, impress strangers, or even inflame rivalries if a dish was perceived as a slight. Though he stood in the kitchen, he was entangled in the invisible web of politics. There were nights when the burden of this knowledge weighed heavily. He would stare into the fire and wonder at the fragility of it all, how a pinch too much salt or a dish served lukewarm could shift opinions. Nobles rarely acknowledged it, yet their moods were shaped by the work of men they never saw. The cook accepted this without pride, but with a quiet awareness. He knew he was both vital and forgotten, celebrated in silence but condemned to obscurity. Still, there were moments when his work touched wonder. He recalled preparing a banquet for the visit of a foreign delegation when the demand was to outshine all expectations. He ordered swans roasted and then redressed in their snowy feathers, their long necks rising proudly from silver platters. He directed the baking of enormous pies, inside which live songbirds had been hidden, so that when the crust was broken, they flew out, filling the hall with fluttering wings and startled laughter. He arranged sugar sculptures so delicate that nobles hesitated to touch them, fearing they might shatter beauty itself. These were acts of theater, not sustenance, but they left imprints in memory, and for a fleeting moment, the cook felt himself more than a servant. He felt like an artist. The kitchen, however, was not all pageantry. It was also a place of sweat, pain, and danger. Burns were constant companions. Knives slipped easily, heavy cauldrons crushed fingers. Apprentices came and went, some broken by the relentless pace, others hardened into survivors. The cook carried scars like invisible badges, reminders of battles fought not on fields of war but against boiling water, sharp steel, and the unyielding demand of time. He never romanticized the labor, though he recognized its dignity. To endure was to prove oneself worthy of the fire. Among his few pleasures was the act of tasting. Though much of what he cooked never reached his own mouth, he allowed himself small sips of sauces, tiny morsels of meats, fragments of sweetness stolen from pastries. These fleeting tastes were like glimpses into another world, a reminder that beyond the exhaustion and expectation, there existed joy in flavor. Sometimes he closed his eyes and let the richness of spiced wine or the sharpness of aged cheese linger, savoring what little reward he could claim. It was not much, but it was enough to remind him why he had chosen this path. The hierarchy of the kitchen mirrored that of the court. He stood at its head, commanding assistants, bakers, butchers, and scullions. Each had a role, each bore the weight of expectation. The youngest boys scrubbed pots until their hands cracked, the older ones turned spits for hours, the bakers worked through the night to ensure bread was ready by dawn. He ruled them with firm discipline, not cruelty but necessity. A single weak link could unravel the entire feast, and so he demanded perfection, knowing that their survival depended on it. Yet sometimes, when the hall was quiet and the rush of duty subsided, he felt affection for them, for their clumsy eagerness and unshaped futures. In their youth he saw echoes of his own beginning, and it stirred a gentleness he rarely revealed. He also knew the dangers of proximity to power. Servants were invisible until they erred, and then they became convenient scapegoats. He had seen more than one life ruined by a spoiled dish or a noble's sour mood. For this reason, he trained himself in humility. He never sought the king's eye, never lingered in the hall, never boasted of his skill. To be unseen was to be safe, and safety was the only treasure he dared to protect. Others might seek recognition, but he knew better. Recognition brought envy, suspicion, and peril. Silence kept him alive. Yet, in the privacy of his thoughts, he sometimes dreamed of being remembered. Not by name, perhaps, but as part of something greater. He imagined future generations speaking of the wonders of feasts, of how kings dined in unmatched splendor. Even if they never knew who had prepared it, he hoped that some trace of his labor would echo in their words, that his work would not vanish entirely into smoke. Perhaps that was why he devoted such care to every dish, why he never allowed himself to grow careless. It was his way of carving memory into the air, even if invisible. Life in the medieval court was unpredictable, but the kitchen never stopped. Whether in times of celebration or mourning, of war or peace, food was always required. And so, the cook endured year after year, season after season, as faces around him changed and stories unfolded above him. He remained constant, a silent witness to history, his life measured not in battles fought or victories won, but in meals prepared, in hunger satisfied, in fires that never went cold. The cook often thought of the seasons not as changes in weather but as changes in flavor. Spring was a time of greens and herbs, fragile shoots gathered from gardens and meadows, tender and full of freshness. Summer brought berries, fish pulled from rivers at their most abundant, and the sweetness of honey. Autumn was the season of harvest, when grains filled the storehouses, when apples were pressed into cider, when geese grew plump in the fields. Winter, however, was the true test, a season of scarcity and preservation, when salted meats and dried legumes became the foundation of survival. To the nobles, feasts seemed endless, but the cook knew the struggle of balance, of stretching stores so that the table never appeared bare even in the leanest months. The cellar beneath the kitchen was as vital as the fire above. Rows of barrels held ale and wine, their wooden staves swelling with the dampness of stone. Sacks of grain lay piled in corners, watched carefully against rats. Hanging from beams were cured hams, smoked fish, and strings of onions. The cook treated this hidden chamber with reverence, for it was both his arsenal and his shield. Without it, he could not fight the constant battle against hunger. He often walked among the shadows, counting and recounting supplies, imagining each barrel and sack as soldiers in an army he commanded against famine. Sometimes, foreign visitors marveled at the abundance of the royal table and assumed it reflected the abundance of the land. The cook knew better. For every roasted goose placed before a noble, there were countless peasants who ate nothing but thin porridge. He had seen them when he ventured beyond the castle walls, faces gaunt, children barefoot, hands roughened by fields that gave too little. He rarely spoke of these things, for his place was not to question but to serve. Yet the contrast lived in his mind, a quiet reminder that feasts were not born of generosity but of inequality. Despite this, he took pride in using every part of what was given to him. Bones became broth, skins became flavoring, scraps became stews. Nothing was wasted, for waste was a luxury even kings could not afford. This frugality was not only necessity but also tradition, passed down from generations of cooks who knew that survival depended on respect for every morsel. He often told his apprentices that true skill lay not in preparing the finest cut of meat, but in making the humblest scrap taste worthy of a king. Entertainment often wove itself into his duties. Nobles expected meals to amuse as much as nourish. There were nights when he presented pies filled not with birds but with musicians, who emerged playing lutes to the astonishment of the hall. On other occasions, he shaped colored jellies into animals that seemed to tremble with life. He once prepared a dish in which a roasted boar's mouth released flames, achieved through hidden powders and clever trickery. These spectacles demanded endless creativity and risk, for failure meant ridicule. Yet when they succeeded, they filled the hall with wonder, and the cook, though unseen, felt the quiet triumph of his invention. The noise of the hall during feasts often reached him in the kitchen. Laughter, songs, arguments, the clatter of goblets, all echoed down the stone corridors. He rarely saw the merriment directly, but he imagined it while standing over boiling pots, knowing that the joy above was born of his labor below. Sometimes, when a cheer rose especially loud, he allowed himself a faint smile, as though he too had joined in the celebration. But the kitchen also had its own sounds, its own music. The crackling of fire, the hiss of fat dripping onto coals, the steady rhythm of knives on wood, the bubbling of cauldrons, these were the melodies of his world. To outsiders it might have seemed harsh, but to him it was comforting, a reminder that life continued in its steady, necessary rhythm. Even in silence, he heard echoes, the whispers of apprentices, the bark of commands, the sigh of a bellows feeding flame. The kitchen was alive, and he moved within it like a conductor of an orchestra only he could fully appreciate. In rare moments of calm, he reflected on how much of himself he had given to this life. His hands bore the marks of labor, his back ached from years of bending, his eyes watered from endless smoke. Yet he did not regret it, for in his own way, he had touched history. Kings had dined at his tables, queens had tasted his sauces, knights had toasted victories over meals he prepared. His presence lingered in countless memories, even if his name did not. He found solace in that thought, that though the world might forget him, it could not erase the joy he had helped create. At times, rumors drifted through the kitchen of distant lands where food was prepared differently, where spices were common, where fruits unknown in his land grew in abundance. He listened with fascination but never with envy. He knew he would never travel, yet through the ingredients that passed into his hands, he felt a connection to that distant world. A handful of saffron threads carried with them the heat of faraway fields. A fig dried under foreign suns spoke of orchards he would never see. The cook realized that though his body remained in one place, his work allowed him to touch the edges of distant horizons. And so his life continued, shaped by fire and flavor, by hunger and satisfaction, by silence and spectacle. He was not remembered in songs, nor carved in stone, yet his presence endured in ways that few recognized. For every banquet that dazzled, for every treaty sealed over a meal, for every noble who left the hall satisfied, the cook's unseen hand had played its part. And in that hidden influence, he found his strange and enduring legacy. Time flowed differently for the cook than it did for those who dined at his tables. While the nobles measured their lives in ceremonies, wars, and marriages, he measured his in hours of preparation, in the rise of dough, the simmer of sauces, the precise timing of roasts. The stone walls of the kitchen witnessed the passage of years more keenly than the tapestries adorning the halls above, for they absorbed smoke, heat, and the quiet sighs of exhaustion. Every mark on those walls told a story: the scrape of a dropped pan, the char of a fire misjudged, the hurried stamp of an apprentice running to deliver a plate on time. To outsiders, it was chaos. To him, it was rhythm, life as constant and necessary as the beating of a heart. The cook's hands were his instruments, and they were skilled in ways few could imagine. He could carve a roast so thin it appeared delicate as lace. He could fold pastries with precision that made the layers almost float. He could blend spices to create flavors that lingered long after the meal ended. And yet, this mastery was never for pride. It was survival, it was duty, it was the unseen art that held the court together. Each motion was deliberate, every choice calculated. He had learned that beauty in the plate could sway minds, ease tempers, and even prevent disputes, for a satisfied stomach often meant a compliant heart. Apprentices and assistants came and went, each leaving their mark on the kitchen, but none replaced the rhythm he had perfected over decades. The young ones struggled, burned themselves, spilled sauces, and forgot orders, yet under his watchful eye, they learned patience, precision, and subtlety. He taught them not merely to cook but to understand the weight of their responsibility. A dish was never just food, it was a statement, a reflection of power, a symbol of the king's reach. One poorly executed meal could become the seed of rumors, while a perfect banquet could cement loyalties. He drilled these lessons into their hands and minds, and in doing so, he ensured that his knowledge would outlast him even if his name did not. Despite the pressures, there were moments of wonder. The arrival of exotic ingredients brought whispers of distant lands into the kitchen. He handled saffron, cinnamon, sugar, and dried fruits as carefully as gold, imagining the caravans and ships that had carried them across mountains and seas. Sometimes he allowed himself the rare luxury of tasting a pinch of these treasures, letting the unfamiliar spice ignite his senses and transport him far beyond the castle walls. In those moments, he felt a connection to the world beyond his kitchen, a reminder that even in a life of confinement, there were threads that linked him to the wider tapestry of existence. Feasts were performances, and he was both director and stagehand. Pies with hidden birds, sculpted sugar, flaming roasts, all required meticulous timing. One misstep could ruin the illusion, invite laughter instead of awe, and compromise his unseen authority. Yet when a plan succeeded, when the hall erupted in astonishment and delight, he allowed himself a quiet satisfaction, a knowledge that his labor had created magic. Nobles rarely noticed the hands that prepared these marvels, but the cook understood the truth. He was the architect of wonder, the hidden force behind celebration. The physical demands were unrelenting. Hours passed in a haze of heat and smoke, knives flashed dangerously close, cauldrons weighed heavy, fires bit at his hands and face. There were scars and burns, aches and blisters, yet he endured. Pain was a constant companion, but so was the sense of purpose. The kitchen was his battlefield, and in its ordered chaos, he found meaning. He knew that beyond these walls, wars raged, alliances shifted, and kingdoms trembled, but in the rhythm of his labor, he maintained a fragile stability that touched every part of the court. Beyond labor, the cook was a keeper of secrets. Conversations in hushed tones passed through the corridors, rumors of plots, alliances, forbidden loves, whispers of treachery. He listened, not because he wished to intervene, but because understanding the court was part of survival. Knowledge was power, yet it was dangerous. A misstep in judgment, a careless word, could undo a lifetime of service. He learned to balance awareness with discretion, to absorb what he needed and ignore what was irrelevant, and in doing so, he became a silent observer of history unfolding above his kitchen fires. Even in moments of monotony, he found subtle joys. The perfect rise of dough, the way a sauce clung to a spoon, the harmony of flavors on a plate. These were rewards in themselves. Though the table would consume them and the guests might never know who was responsible, he took solace in the creation, in the act of mastery itself. It was a quiet triumph, private and enduring, unlike the fleeting praise sought by nobles. The kitchen, with its smell of roasting meat, burning wood, and sweetened fruits, became a sanctuary where his skill and dedication manifested into something tangible. He often reflected on the contrasts of his existence. Outside the castle walls, common folk endured hunger and toil, while inside, the hallways smelled of roasted meats, fresh bread, and spices from distant lands. He understood that his craft was part of a system both wondrous and unjust. Yet he did not despair. His work provided sustenance, joy, and diplomacy. Each meal was a thread in the fabric of society, connecting royalty and subjects, tradition and innovation, labor and celebration. Through this lens, his life, though unseen, was essential, shaping more than taste. It shaped experience, memory, and even history. And so, day after day, season after season, year after year, he persisted. He remained the unseen architect of feasts, the silent guardian of flavor and presentation, the tireless force that transformed raw ingredients into art, sustenance, and spectacle. His legacy was not written in chronicles or carved in stone, but it lived on in every satisfied sigh, every toast raised, every memory of a meal that dazzled, comforted, or amazed. The cook's life was invisible to most, yet it was integral, woven deeply into the hidden heartbeat of the medieval court, and in that unseen influence lay the quiet nobility of his existence. The cook had long learned that mastery in the kitchen demanded more than skill with knife and fire. It demanded patience, observation, and a quiet understanding of human nature. Every dish was a message, every feast a negotiation of perception. He observed the way nobles ate, the subtle movements of their hands, the expressions that flitted across their faces as they tasted flavors both familiar and foreign. He knew which lords preferred heavily spiced meats and which ladies enjoyed subtler combinations, which guests were prone to complaints and which were easily pleased. Each meal became a study in psychology, an invisible dialogue conducted entirely through food. Sometimes the demands of the court were almost surreal. On occasion, the king would demand a banquet to outshine a neighboring realm, requesting quantities and extravagances that seemed impossible. Entire pigs were roasted and glazed with honey, piles of fruits and pastries assembled in elaborate towers, sauces infused with saffron and rose water flowed across platters in impossible abundance. In these moments, the cook orchestrated a symphony of labor, commanding assistants, timing fires, supervising bakers, and tasting constantly to ensure perfection. He rarely left the kitchen for such occasions, Yet the world outside relied on his ability to make the impossible appear effortless. Despite the pressure, he took pride in small innovations. He experimented in secret, blending herbs, spices, and techniques learned from travelers, merchants, and scribes. Occasionally, he discovered combinations that delighted even the most discerning nobles, flavors that were remembered long after the meal had ended. These moments were private victories, their significance invisible to anyone but himself. They were proof that even within the rigid hierarchy of the kitchen, creativity had a place, and that artistry could thrive in service as well as in fame. The apprenticeship system demanded discipline and patience, and he enforced it rigorously. Young boys arrived eager but clumsy, their hands too soft, their understanding too limited. Under his guidance, they learned precision, timing, and the importance of ritual in cooking. He instructed them in the careful measurement of ingredients, the timing of fires, and the layering of flavors. He taught them to observe not only recipes but the moods of those they served, to anticipate the desires of the king or a visiting diplomat. Mistakes were corrected swiftly and severely, for in a royal kitchen, errors were not forgiven lightly. Yet, when an apprentice succeeded, he offered quiet praise, a rare and meaningful reward in a world that demanded excellence without acknowledgement. The physical labor was unending. Fires needed constant tending, meat had to be rotated and basted, sauces stirred without pause. He learned to work with an almost meditative rhythm, the repetition of tasks grounding him in a reality that was otherwise unpredictable. His hands bore scars from knives, burns, and repeated labor, a map of his life etched in flesh. Yet, each scar was a testament to survival, to persistence, and to mastery. They were invisible to the world, yet they told the story of a life lived in devotion to craft, an unrecognized heroism that sustained the grandeur of the court. The cook also learned to navigate the politics of his own environment. Nobles occasionally slipped into the kitchen, curious or demanding, testing his temper and resolve. He had to manage their requests delicately, balancing respect with authority, ensuring that he maintained control over his domain without offending powerful individuals. One wrong word, one misplaced gesture, could shift a noble's perception or spark a rumor that might endanger his position. In this delicate dance, he demonstrated that influence did not always reside in titles or armies. It could exist in quiet mastery, in the unseen hands that fed and guided the court. In moments of reflection, he often considered the ephemeral nature of his work. A feast could be lavish and magnificent, yet within hours, every dish would be consumed, leaving only empty plates and memory. His labor vanished almost as soon as it was created, and yet it had power, shaping celebrations, moods, and even political outcomes. This paradox fascinated him, to create something transient that carried immense significance. He had come to accept that this was the essence of his role, and in that acceptance, he found a sense of quiet purpose. He also understood the importance of continuity. Recipes passed down from previous generations guided his hands, preserving tradition even as he introduced innovation. He respected the methods of the past, knowing that a deviation from proven techniques could result in disaster. Yet he also observed the evolving tastes of the court, incorporating new spices, techniques, and ideas as they arrived. In this balance of tradition and adaptation, he found the secret to sustaining the trust of nobles while leaving his own subtle mark on the history of taste. The kitchen itself became a universe apart from the world above. Its walls absorbed the smells of centuries, its fires burned with relentless constancy, its stones remembered the weight of every cauldron lifted and every loaf kneaded. He found comfort in this permanence, even as the world beyond shifted with wars, politics, and fleeting desires. The rhythm of chopping, stirring, tasting, and seasoning became a measure of time, a personal chronicle written not in ink, but in flavor, smell, and texture. It was a quiet, invisible history, yet it held profound importance in the lives of those who never paused to recognize it. And so, day after day, he endured, shaping the life of the court through labor, patience, and insight. His influence was subtle, hidden, yet undeniable. The tables he set and the meals he prepared were part of the fabric of power, the invisible threads connecting rulers, diplomats, and guests. Though he remained unnamed in chronicles and largely forgotten by history, his work resonated in every satisfied sigh, every toast raised, every memory of a meal that dazzled, comforted, or astonished. In this unseen, uncelebrated influence lay the quiet nobility of his existence, the enduring legacy of a man who gave shape to the life of kings without ever seeking the spotlight. Even within the vast, echoing halls of the royal kitchen, the cook sometimes felt a peculiar solitude, a separation from the life above that no feast, no applause, no recognition could bridge. He moved among fires, cauldrons, and chopping blocks with precise steps, yet his world was defined by the rhythm of labor rather than the conversation or ceremony of the court. He observed the nobles through glimpses, flash of silk sleeves, the glint of jeweled rings, the rise and fall of voices, but always from a distance, always framed by the haze of steam and smoke. This distance gave him perspective, allowed him to witness the subtle dramas unfolding in the halls, to understand the ambitions, anxieties, and follies of those who thought themselves untouchable. He knew that a banquet was far more than a meal, it was a theater of influence. Every plate, every serving carried a message. He understood that a lavish presentation could soothe anger, impress an ally, or subtly remind everyone present who commanded resources and power. In this, he saw the strange gravity of his position. A man whose hands could alter perceptions, whose skill could affect loyalty and morale, yet whose face was rarely seen and whose name seldom spoken. The court depended on him, yet it could discard him in an instant. This duality shaped his existence, instilling caution, patience, and a deep appreciation for the quiet dignity of labor. Apprentices and assistants formed an extension of his will, yet they were also a source of constant concern. He trained them with exacting discipline, showing them how to measure, season, and time each step, instilling in them a sense of purpose and responsibility. A young boy who hesitated or misjudged a flame could ruin a feast, creating embarrassment or, worse, political tension. Yet, the cook also recognized the potential in each apprentice, understanding that with guidance, they might one day carry forward his work, preserving traditions while shaping new possibilities. He taught them not only technique but also observation, teaching them to read the moods of the hall, to sense the subtle preferences of nobles, to understand that their craft extended beyond ingredients and into the realm of perception and influence. He often reflected on the paradox of his own sustenance. The finest meats, freshest vegetables, and richest sauces passed through his hands, yet he rarely partook in these luxuries. He and his staff made do with scraps, reused bones for broth, and consumed portions far humbler than those presented to the king. There was a quiet resignation in this, yet also a sense of discipline. Hunger became familiar, patience became second nature, and through these constraints, he learned a kind of resilience rare in those accustomed to indulgence. The contrast between abundance above and modesty below was a constant reminder of the layered reality of his world. The arrival of exotic ingredients was always a moment of intrigue. Spices from distant lands, sugar, dried fruits, and rare meats brought whispers of faraway places into the kitchen. Handling them required care, for their cost was immense and their scarcity ensured their value. He imagined the perilous journeys these items had taken, from caravans crossing deserts to ships braving stormy seas, and he felt a strange kinship with these travelers. Though he would never leave the kitchen, through these ingredients, he touched the world beyond the castle walls, connecting the isolation of his labor with the vastness of distant lands. Each pinch of spice, each fragment of foreign produce was a thread to places he might never see, yet which he held close in his mind as he worked. Entertainment often merged seamlessly with sustenance. He devised pies that released songbirds, roasted birds adorned in their feathers, sugar sculptures that seemed alive, and flaming roasts that startled and delighted. Each performance demanded ingenuity, timing, and precision. Failures were not permitted, for the nobles would notice immediately. Success, however, brought invisible triumph, a satisfaction that only he, hidden behind cauldrons and counters, could experience fully. In these moments, he felt an intimate connection with both artistry and influence, knowing that his unseen hand could shape joy, surprise, and admiration in ways beyond the power of words or weapons. Physical labor remained relentless. Hours melted into each other, filled with heat, smoke, and the constant vigilance of timing. Fire could not be left unattended, meats could not be neglected, sauces required constant attention. Even the act of kneading dough became an exercise in endurance and precision, for each loaf reflected the broader standards of the court. Hands bore scars, backs ached, eyes burned from smoke and steam, yet these were badges of mastery, silent proof of his role in sustaining the grandeur of the palace. Pain and fatigue were constants, yet they were tempered by the sense of purpose, by the quiet knowledge that his labor touched history. The cook's understanding of the court extended beyond food. He observed politics, alliances, whispered secrets, and rivalries from his position in the kitchen. He learned the subtle language of behavior, noting who avoided whom, who lingered, who spoke sharply, and who softened their tone. Knowledge of these dynamics informed his work: which dishes to emphasize, how to arrange feasts, when to anticipate demands, and how to avoid causing offense inadvertently. His awareness became a form of influence, quiet but essential, shaping the court from the shadows as surely as any decree issued from a throne. In quiet moments, he reflected on his legacy. His work was transient, yet powerful. Feasts vanished, plates emptied, memories faded, and yet the impressions he created endured. The laughter, satisfaction, and awe of those who dined were lasting echoes of his unseen labor. He realized that history often overlooked men like him, yet without their skill, the grandeur of courts, the diplomacy of meals, and even the smooth functioning of daily life would falter. His was a legacy of sustenance, spectacle, and subtle influence, invisible to most, yet profoundly shaping the lives of all around him. Through all of this, he endured, persisted, and perfected. Each day, each meal, each performance became a continuation of a life devoted entirely to craft. He remained hidden, uncelebrated, yet indispensable. And in the rhythm of his labor, the chopping, the stirring, the tasting, the arranging, he found meaning, dignity, and the quiet nobility of a life spent feeding kings, shaping perceptions, and sustaining history from the unseen, smoke-filled heart of the medieval kitchen. The cook's life was a balance between chaos and control, a continuous negotiation with time, fire, and human expectation. He had learned to read the subtle signals of the hall above even before tasting a dish: the quick glance of a lord, the way a cup was lifted and set down, the faint murmur of voices that hinted at approval or discontent. These signs guided his work, influencing seasoning, presentation, and timing. He realized that a banquet was not merely a meal but a performance in which every participant, from the highest-ranking noble to the lowliest servant, played a part, and he, unseen, was both conductor and unseen architect. Seasons dictated much of his rhythm. Spring brought tender vegetables, wild herbs, and the first fresh eggs. Summer offered berries, fish, and milk at its richest. Autumn required preservation, drying, and pickling. Winter demanded resourcefulness, turning salted meats, legumes, and root vegetables into satisfying meals that masked scarcity with skill. Each change in the calendar brought challenges and opportunities. He measured not only ingredients but the passage of time itself, attuned to the cycles of nature as intimately as any farmer in the fields. He understood that his success depended on respecting these rhythms and adapting to them with ingenuity. The arrival of foreign ingredients remained a source of fascination and inspiration. Spices, sugar, exotic fruits, and dried goods carried stories of distant lands, perilous journeys, and the labor of countless hands. He handled them with care, aware of their value and potential to transform a meal from ordinary to extraordinary. A pinch of saffron, a hint of cinnamon, or a few dried figs could elevate a dish, delighting even the most demanding of nobles. These small miracles reminded him that, though confined to the kitchen, he could touch the wider world, bringing a taste of distant horizons to the castle halls. The apprentices were both a challenge and a joy. Young boys arrived eager but clumsy, unsure of how to balance knives, stir sauces, or measure spices. Under his guidance, they learned discipline, patience, and subtlety. He taught them to observe the court, anticipate needs, and understand that their craft extended beyond mere food. It was influence, psychology, and artistry all at once. Mistakes were corrected with firm hands, yet successes were quietly celebrated, a rare acknowledgement in a world that demanded excellence without recognition. In training others, he preserved the knowledge of generations, ensuring that the unseen legacy of the kitchen would endure. Physical labor defined his days. Fires demanded constant attention, meats needed careful rotation, sauces required vigilance, and bread had to rise precisely. Hands bore the marks of knives and burns, backs ached from long hours of bending over cauldrons, and eyes burned from smoke and steam. Each scar, each ache, was a testament to endurance and mastery. Pain was a companion, yet it was tempered by purpose. Every dish he prepared, every feast he orchestrated, connected him to the larger rhythm of the court, the pulse of the kingdom, and the unseen history being written in flavors, aromas, and textures. Entertainment and spectacle were inseparable from sustenance. He devised pies that concealed songbirds, roasted birds adorned with feathers, sugar sculptures that seemed alive, and flaming roasts that startled and delighted. Each creation demanded ingenuity, foresight, and precise timing. Failure could bring embarrassment or even punishment. Success brought invisible triumph, a satisfaction felt only by him, hidden in the shadows of the kitchen. Through these performances, he became not only a provider of sustenance but a creator of wonder, an architect of experiences that shaped the moods and perceptions of those who believed themselves sovereign. The cook's understanding of the court extended beyond food. He listened to whispers of alliances, disputes, and secret desires. He watched gestures, facial expressions, and interactions that others overlooked. This awareness informed his work, which dishes to emphasize, how to sequence courses, when to present certain flavors to influence mood, and how to avoid offense. He realized that influence did not always reside in titles, armies, or wealth. Sometimes, it existed in the precise arrangement of a plate, the balance of a sauce, or the careful timing of a toast. He wielded this power quietly, shaping outcomes without ever appearing in the chronicles. Moments of quiet reflection reminded him of the ephemeral nature of his craft. Feasts disappeared in hours, plates were cleared, leftovers discarded, memories faded. Yet within this transience lay enduring influence. A single meal could cement alliances, soothe anger, inspire loyalty, or impress foreign dignitaries. Though unnamed and uncelebrated, his labor carried significance far beyond the kitchen walls. The cook understood that history often overlooked those who worked in shadows, yet without them, the grandeur of courts, the rhythm of diplomacy, and even the sustenance of daily life would falter. Amidst all labor, he discovered small pleasures, the perfect rise of bread, the harmony of a sauce, the subtle layering of flavors, the warmth of fire against his hands, the satisfaction of timing a dish to perfection. Though unobserved, these moments were intimate victories, rewards that nourished the spirit even when the body remained weary. They reminded him why he persisted, why he endured, why he devoted his life to craft that was fleeting yet powerful. In the rhythm of chopping, stirring, tasting, and arranging, he found meaning, dignity, and a sense of quiet triumph. Through decades of labor, the cook became an invisible historian, a silent witness to the rhythms of power, ceremony, and human folly. He shaped the experiences of kings and nobles through flavor and presentation, leaving traces that lingered long after dishes were consumed. His life was one of paradox, unseen yet essential, transient yet influential, laborious yet artful. In this balance, he discovered the quiet nobility of his existence, the enduring legacy of a man who fed kings, influenced perception, and sustained history from the unseen heart of the medieval kitchen. The life of a royal cook was defined not only by labor but also by observation, intuition, and the constant negotiation between artistry and practicality. Every dish had a purpose beyond nourishment. It was a message, a reflection of the court, a symbol of authority and taste. The cook learned to anticipate the desires of nobles, to predict the whims of the king, and to craft meals that both satisfied and impressed. The pressure was relentless, for a single misstep could provoke dissatisfaction, spark gossip, or even jeopardize his position. Yet within this pressure, he discovered the delicate balance that shaped his craft, the rhythm that guided every motion of hand and knife. Even mundane tasks carried significance. The peeling of vegetables, the kneading of dough, the trimming of meat, all were acts that required precision, patience, and mindfulness. Each motion, repeated thousands of times, became a meditation in itself. He found meaning in the repetition, in the rhythm of chopping, stirring, and seasoning. The kitchen was alive with sound, the hiss of sizzling meat, the crackle of flames, the rhythmic chop of knives, the bubbling of sauces. These sounds were more than noise. They were signals, guiding his work and anchoring his consciousness in the present moment. In this symphony of labor, he found both challenge and solace. Feasts remained a stage where his skills were tested and displayed. Elaborate pies, roasted game, sculpted sugar, and flaming roasts were not mere decoration, they were instruments of influence. He understood that the arrangement of a platter, the pairing of flavors, the visual spectacle of a dish, could manipulate perception and emotion. A well-executed meal could calm tensions, charm guests, or impress a visiting dignitary. Each course was carefully planned, timed, and presented, a subtle orchestration of human reaction. Though he remained unseen, his impact extended far beyond the kitchen walls. Apprentices continued to challenge and inspire him. Each new generation brought fresh enthusiasm but also inexperience, demanding guidance, correction, and patience. He taught them not only technique but also awareness, the ability to read the hall, anticipate the desires of nobles, and understand that every action had consequence. Mistakes were costly, yet they were also opportunities to instill discipline and insight. In mentoring them, he preserved the knowledge of his craft while ensuring that its subtle influence would continue into the future. The success of an apprentice was, in its own quiet way, a reflection of his own legacy. Seasonal changes dictated much of his work, as they did for the entire castle. Spring offered fresh greens, tender herbs, and the first eggs, while summer brought abundance in fruits, vegetables, and fish. Autumn required preservation, curing meats, drying fruits, and storing grains for the winter months. Winter was the ultimate test, a season of scarcity that demanded ingenuity and careful planning. He learned to stretch limited resources into satisfying meals, using every scrap and residue to create flavor, substance, and impression. Each season presented its challenges, and each challenge honed his skill, deepening his understanding of both ingredients and people. The arrival of exotic ingredients was a window to distant lands, a reminder that the world extended far beyond stone walls and kitchens. Spices, sugar, dried fruits, and rare meats brought stories of caravans, ships, deserts, and faraway orchards. He handled these treasures with care, aware of their cost and potential to transform a meal. A pinch of saffron, a dash of cinnamon, or a few dried figs could elevate a dish from ordinary to extraordinary, creating wonder and delight among those who dined. Through these flavors, he connected his work to distant lands, imagining the journeys each ingredient had taken to reach his hands. The physical demands never ceased. Fires required constant attention, meats needed careful rotation, sauces had to be stirred without pause, and bread needed precise kneading and timing. Hands bore the scars of knives and burns, backs ached from long hours of bending over cauldrons, and eyes stung from smoke and steam. Yet these hardships were tempered by purpose. Each dish prepared, each feast orchestrated, tied him to the rhythm of the court, the pulse of the kingdom, and the subtle shaping of history through flavor and presentation. Politics and intrigue often filtered down into the kitchen. Whispers of alliances, rivalries, secret liaisons, and plots reached his ears. He listened not out of curiosity alone, but because knowledge informed his work. Understanding the subtleties of the court allowed him to anticipate needs, avoid missteps, and subtly influence outcomes. Influence, he realized, did not always reside in armies or titles. It could be exercised quietly through timing, presentation, and taste. He wielded this influence invisibly, shaping events without recognition, a ghostly presence in the life of the court. Moments of reflection reminded him of the transient nature of his craft. Feasts vanished, plates emptied, memories faded, yet the impressions remained. A single meal could ease tensions, inspire loyalty, or create admiration. Though unnamed in history, his labor had a ripple effect, shaping experiences and outcomes in ways most would never recognize. In the quiet, he found satisfaction knowing that his work, though fleeting, carried weight, and that his existence, though hidden, had meaning. Thus, he endured, day after day, season after season, year after year. He perfected, adapted, and persisted, mastering the art of cooking, observation, and subtle influence. In the rhythm of chopping, stirring, tasting, and arranging, he discovered meaning, dignity, and quiet triumph. He remained unseen, uncelebrated, yet indispensable, a man whose hands shaped the lives of kings, influenced perception, and left an enduring, though invisible, mark on history through the hidden, smoke-filled heart of the medieval kitchen. Life in the kitchen was a study in contrasts. It was simultaneously regimented and chaotic, silent and noisy, physically demanding and intellectually engaging. The cook had learned to move within this paradox with precision and grace, each step measured, each motion deliberate, each decision influenced by both tradition and instinct. He observed the flames, the bubbling of sauces, the texture of dough, the sizzle of meats, and understood them as more than mere culinary phenomena. They were signals, guides, and tools. The kitchen itself became an extension of his mind, a place where the logic of timing, the chemistry of ingredients, and the psychology of taste converged. He often thought about the power of presentation. Nobles judged the meal not only by taste but by spectacle. The arrangement of dishes, the gleam of polished platters, the artistry of garnishes. He orchestrated these visual elements with the same care as he did flavor, understanding that the appearance of abundance, precision, and elegance could influence moods, impress allies, and assert the sophistication of the court. Each placement, each decorative flourish, carried subtle messages of hierarchy, wealth, and authority, and he executed these with meticulous attention, knowing that the smallest error could ripple across perception. Apprentices continued to test his patience and skill. They arrived with eagerness, curiosity, and often clumsy hands, requiring constant guidance and correction. He taught them not only the mechanics of cooking but the philosophy behind it, that food was communication, influence, and culture, not merely sustenance. They learned to taste thoughtfully, observe the court, anticipate desires, and understand that every motion carried consequence. A single misplaced ingredient could alter perception, disrupt harmony, or offend a delicate palate. In teaching them, he also reinforced his own mastery, refining skills and insights that had been honed over decades. The changing seasons dictated both challenge and opportunity. Spring brought freshness, tender shoots, herbs, early eggs, and soft vegetables. Summer offered richness in fruits, vegetables, fish, and game. Autumn demanded preservation, curing meats, drying fruits, storing grains, and creating meals that would endure the leaner winter months. Winter tested ingenuity, requiring resourcefulness to transform limited ingredients into satisfying feasts. Each season sharpened his skill, offering lessons in timing, preservation, and adaptation. It was a continuous education, a cycle of learning that never ended. The arrival of exotic ingredients was a constant source of fascination. Spices, sugar, rare dried fruits, and imported delicacies carried stories of distant lands, perilous journeys, and the hands of countless people. He handled these treasures with care, aware of both their cost and their potential to elevate a meal into something extraordinary. A pinch of saffron, a hint of clove, or a touch of exotic sugar could transform a dish, delighting even the most critical of nobles. In these moments, he felt connected to the wider world, imagining caravans crossing deserts, ships braving storms, and orchards in lands he would never see, yet whose products passed through his hands to reach the king's table. Physical labor was relentless. Fires demanded constant attention, meats had to be rotated and basted, sauces required vigilance, bread needed precise kneading and timing. His hands bore scars from knives, burns, and relentless work. His back ached from long hours of bending over cauldrons. His eyes stung from smoke and steam. Yet these hardships were balanced by purpose and pride. Each successful meal, each orchestrated feast, tied him to the rhythm of the court, the pulse of the kingdom, and the subtle shaping of history itself. Pain and fatigue became companions rather than obstacles, reminders of the significance of his labor. Entertainment intertwined seamlessly with sustenance. Pies concealed live birds, roasted game was adorned with feathers, sugar sculptures mimicked life, and flaming roasts startled and delighted the court. These creations demanded ingenuity, foresight, and precise timing. A single miscalculation could provoke disappointment or gossip, yet success brought invisible triumph, a private satisfaction known only to him, hidden behind smoke and cauldrons. Through these spectacles, he became not merely a cook but an architect of experience, a manipulator of mood and perception, wielding influence silently and effectively. Politics inevitably reached the kitchen. Whispers of alliances, rivalries, secret liaisons, and court intrigues reached his ears, filtered through servants and assistants. He listened attentively, not out of idle curiosity but because understanding these dynamics was crucial to anticipating needs, avoiding missteps, and subtly guiding outcomes. He realized that power did not always reside in armies, titles, or decrees. It could exist in the timing of a dish, the combination of flavors, or the precise moment a toast was offered. His influence was quiet, unseen, yet profoundly felt. Reflection reminded him of the ephemeral nature of his craft. Feasts vanished, plates were emptied, leftovers discarded, and yet the impressions lingered. A single meal could smooth tensions, inspire loyalty, or impress visitors. History might overlook his contributions, yet the echoes of his labor resonated in the court long after the smoke cleared. In these quiet moments, he recognized the depth of his impact, unseen, uncelebrated, yet essential. And so he persisted. Day after day, season after season, year after year, he refined, adapted, and endured. His mastery extended beyond the culinary to observation, psychology, and influence. In the rhythm of chopping, stirring, tasting, and arranging, he discovered dignity, purpose, and quiet triumph. He remained unseen and unrecognized, yet indispensable, a man whose hands shaped kings' lives, guided perceptions, and left an enduring mark on history, hidden in the smoky heart of the medieval kitchen. The cook learned that mastery involved more than technique. It demanded a keen understanding of people, their habits, their moods, and their expectations. A feast was a complex social performance, and he, though unseen, was its silent conductor. He observed the subtle behaviors of the nobles, the quick glance that betrayed irritation, the faint smile that indicated approval, the hesitation that signaled uncertainty. Each movement informed his choices, the seasoning of a sauce, the timing of a course, the arrangement of a platter. Over time, he became adept at reading human behavior with almost surgical precision, translating observation into action that could influence the entire atmosphere of a banquet. Apprentices remained both a challenge and a joy. They arrived eager, curious, and inexperienced, often making mistakes that could disrupt the delicate balance of the kitchen. He corrected them firmly, yet with patience, teaching not only how to chop, stir, or season, but also how to anticipate the desires of the court and understand the invisible threads of influence carried in every dish. They learned to taste critically, observe attentively, and consider the political and social impact of every plate served. In nurturing these young cooks, he ensured the continuity of his craft, passing on skills, secrets, and subtle wisdom that would outlast his own presence. Seasons dictated the rhythm of the kitchen. Spring brought delicate greens, early herbs, and the first fresh eggs, while summer offered an abundance of fruits, vegetables, and game. Autumn required preservation, curing meats, drying fruits, and storing grains to sustain the court through winter. Winter demanded resourcefulness, transforming limited ingredients into meals that were both filling and elegant. Each season was a lesson in adaptation, creativity, and timing, sharpening his skill and deepening his understanding of both ingredients and human appetite. He learned to anticipate changes, to adjust techniques, and to find opportunity even in scarcity. The arrival of exotic ingredients was always a highlight, a window into distant lands. Spices, sugar, dried fruits, rare meats, and other luxuries brought stories of perilous journeys, distant markets, and the labor of countless hands. He handled them with reverence, aware of their rarity, cost, and potential to elevate a dish into the extraordinary. A few threads of saffron, a touch of cinnamon, or a handful of figs could transform a meal, creating wonder and delight among even the most discerning nobles. These flavors connected him to the broader world, allowing him to touch lands he would never see through the stories carried in the ingredients themselves. Physical labor was unceasing and often punishing. Fires demanded vigilance, sauces required constant stirring, meats had to be rotated, and bread needed precise kneading. His hands bore cuts and burns, his back ached from hours of bending over cauldrons, and his eyes burned from smoke and steam. Yet in this hardship he found purpose. Each dish prepared, each feast orchestrated, tied him to the rhythm of the court, the pulse of the kingdom, and the subtle shaping of human experience. Pain and fatigue were constant companions, reminders of the value of persistence and the depth of mastery. Entertainment and spectacle were inseparable from sustenance. He devised pies that concealed live birds, roasted game adorned with feathers, sugar sculptures shaped like animals, and flaming roasts that startled and delighted. Each creation required ingenuity, timing, and precise execution. Mistakes could provoke disappointment or gossip, yet success brought invisible triumph, a quiet satisfaction known only to him, hidden behind smoke, fire, and cauldrons. Through these performances, he became not merely a provider of food but a creator of experiences, a manipulator of perception and mood, influencing the court in subtle, profound ways. Politics and intrigue often reached the kitchen. Whispers of alliances, rivalries, clandestine meetings, and secret liaisons traveled through servants and assistants, often arriving at his ears. He listened attentively, knowing that understanding these dynamics was essential to avoid missteps and subtly guide outcomes. Power, he realized, did not only reside in armies, titles, or formal decrees. It could exist in the timing of a dish, the combination of flavors, or the precise moment a toast was offered. In this way, he wielded influence invisibly, shaping outcomes and moods without ever stepping into the spotlight. He reflected frequently on the ephemeral nature of his craft. Feasts disappeared within hours, plates were cleared, leftovers discarded, yet the impressions endured. A single meal could ease tension, inspire loyalty, or impress visiting dignitaries. Though unnamed in the annals of history, his work resonated in the court, echoing through reactions, conversations, and the memories of those he served. In these moments of reflection, he recognized that his labor, though transient, held power and purpose, shaping events and experiences in ways that most would never understand. Through all this, he persisted. Season after season, year after year, he refined, adapted, and endured. His mastery extended beyond culinary skill to observation, psychology, and influence. In the rhythm of chopping, stirring, tasting, and arranging, he found purpose, dignity, and quiet triumph. He remained unseen, uncelebrated, yet indispensable, a man whose hands shaped kings' lives, guided perception, and left an enduring mark on history from the unseen, smoke-filled heart of the medieval kitchen. The cook's understanding of his craft extended beyond the mere preparation of food. He had become a silent observer of human nature, a recorder of behavior, a subtle influencer of moods and decisions. He realized that a banquet was more than a meal. It was an event, a carefully orchestrated display of wealth, power, and taste. Every element, from the selection of ingredients to the arrangement of dishes, carried meaning. A touch of luxury here, a modest presentation there, a carefully timed course, all contributed to the perception of the court. He understood that his role was not just to feed but to shape the experience, to craft an atmosphere that reflected the sophistication and authority of the rulers he served. Apprentices continued to shape his days. They arrived bright-eyed and eager, yet inexperienced, and often made mistakes that could compromise the delicate rhythm of the kitchen. He corrected them firmly, yet with patience, teaching not only technique but also insight, how to read the court, anticipate desires, and understand that the flavor of a dish could influence more than appetite. It could affect moods, relationships, and even political perceptions. Mistakes were lessons, successes quietly celebrated. In training them, he ensured that the knowledge, skill, and subtle wisdom of the kitchen would survive beyond his tenure, passed down to future generations. The rhythm of the seasons dictated the flow of the kitchen. Spring brought tender vegetables, fresh herbs, and the first eggs, while summer offered abundance in fruits, vegetables, fish, and game. Autumn demanded preservation, drying, curing, and storing to sustain the court through winter. Winter was the ultimate test, challenging his creativity and resourcefulness as he transformed limited ingredients into satisfying and elegant meals. Each season honed his skill, reinforced his adaptability, and deepened his understanding of both ingredients and the desires of those he served. He learned to work with scarcity, to find opportunity within limitation, and to create abundance from what was available. Exotic ingredients fascinated him endlessly. Spices, sugar, rare dried fruits, and imported delicacies carried tales of distant lands, perilous journeys, and the labor of countless hands. He treated these treasures with care, conscious of their rarity, expense, and potential to elevate a dish into something extraordinary. A few strands of saffron, a hint of clove, or a handful of figs could transform a meal, creating wonder and delight among the most discerning nobles. Through these flavors, he felt a connection to the wider world, imagining caravans crossing deserts, ships navigating treacherous seas, and orchards in lands he would never see, yet whose bounty passed through his hands to reach the king's table. The physical demands of his work never ceased. Fires required constant attention, meats needed turning and basting, sauces demanded vigilance, bread required careful kneading and timing. His hands bore the scars of knives and burns, his back ached from long hours, his eyes stung from smoke and steam. Yet these hardships were tempered by purpose. Every dish prepared, every feast orchestrated, tied him to the rhythm of the court, the pulse of the kingdom, and the subtle shaping of history. Pain and fatigue became markers of skill, resilience, and devotion. Entertainment and spectacle were inseparable from sustenance. He created pies that concealed live birds, roasted game adorned with feathers, sugar sculptures shaped like animals, and flaming roasts that startled and delighted the court. Each creation required ingenuity, timing, and careful execution. Mistakes could provoke disappointment or gossip, yet success brought invisible triumph, a quiet satisfaction known only to him, hidden behind smoke, fire, and cauldrons. Through these spectacles, he became not merely a cook but a manipulator of perception, a shaper of mood, influencing the court in profound, unseen ways. Intrigue inevitably seeped into the kitchen. Whispers of alliances, rivalries, clandestine meetings, and secret liaisons arrived through servants and assistants, reaching his ears. He listened with attention, understanding that knowledge allowed him to anticipate needs, avoid missteps, and subtly guide outcomes. Power did not always reside in armies or titles. It could be exercised through timing, flavor, and presentation. His influence, though invisible, was effective, shaping perceptions and outcomes without recognition or acclaim. The transient nature of his craft weighed on him, yet also gave him perspective. Feasts vanished, plates emptied, leftovers discarded, yet impressions lingered. A single meal could calm anger, inspire loyalty, or impress visiting dignitaries. Though unnamed in history, his labor resonated in the court, echoing through reactions, conversations, and memories. In these moments, he recognized that his work, though fleeting, carried power, influence, and purpose. And so he continued, season after season, year after year, refining, adapting, and enduring. His mastery encompassed more than culinary skill. It included observation, psychology, and subtle influence. In the rhythm of chopping, stirring, tasting, and arranging, he discovered dignity, purpose, and quiet triumph. He remained unseen, uncelebrated, yet indispensable, a man whose hands shaped the lives of kings, guided perception, and left an enduring mark on history from the hidden, smoke-filled heart of the medieval kitchen.